Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this Keystone Symposia ePanel discussion on the impacts of climate change and human health. I'm Thale Jarvis, Chief Scientific Officer at Keystone Symposia, and I'd like to welcome you to this event. Keystone Symposia has a long history of programming outstanding events in the life sciences, largely focusing on the underlying molecular and cellular mechanisms that drive fundamental biological processes involved in health and disease. This ePanel is a collaborative initiative with the Global Consortium on Climate and Health Education. This is part of a series of virtual events focused on specific aspects of climate and health, and arises from a broad recognition that climate change is a growing contributor to a variety of health-related concerns, from air quality and respiratory health to infectious disease and heat stress. We also recognize that these health impacts fall unequally across various populations, raising concerns about health equity and the need to build resiliency in our healthcare systems to address systemic inequities arising from climate change. This ePanel series is part of a larger initiative at Keystone Symposia to lower our carbon footprint and democratize access to compelling scientific content through an expanding offering of virtual content. With that, I'd like to welcome Cecilia Sorensen, the Director of the Global Consortium on Climate and Health Education.
Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. We are delighted that you are joining us here today for this ePanel series on climate change and health. My name is Cecilia Sorensen, and I am the Director of the Global Consortium on Climate and Health Education. Our mission is to ensure that 100% of health professionals globally have the knowledge and skills to prepare for and respond to the climate and health crisis, as we know that impacts are already happening and affecting the most vulnerable patients and communities globally. The GCCHE was founded in 2017 at the Conference of Parties in Paris, and today has grown into a vibrant community of over 300 health professional schools from 50 different countries, all who have pledged to train their students in climate and planetary health. We represent schools of nursing, medicine, pharmacy, public health, social work, dentistry, and veterinary medicine. We are so delighted to be partnering with the Keystone Symposia to bring you this ePanel series on climate change and health, where we bring together experts from around the world to tackle some of the most pressing challenges of our time. Together, our communities have the opportunity to bridge the gap between scientific research and clinical and public health practice, to bring to the forefront collaborations and solutions where they are needed most. So we hope you will join us for the networking session after this event as we continue to build this exciting partnership. Additionally, we invite you to explore our masterclass series, where leading experts in climate and environmental health discuss emerging research and the scientific basis for this work. So thank you for joining us today. We hope you will enjoy this discussion and look forward to working with you.
Hello, everybody. My name is Madeline Thompson. I'm delighted to be with you here today. I'm going to moderate this very exciting ePanel. It's a huge pleasure for me to be able to participate in this process, and a big thank you both to Keystones and to Cecilia for enabling this panel to go forward. I will start the process first by giving you a little introduction to myself, which might explain why I'm here. And then a little bit of background of the context of the panel that we've developed. I'll then have the opportunity to introduce you to our panelists, and we will go ahead from there. So I had the pleasure to co-author a paper in the New England Journal of Medicine with a colleague, Larry Stanbury from the medical school at Columbia University in the last month, and which is focused on vector-borne diseases and climate change. And I'd just like to use some of the scene setting description to introduce and create the scene setting for our panel. And that is to start with, of course, that the effects of climate change are now widespread and rapidly intensifying, largely driven by greenhouse gas emissions from burning of fossil fuels, and that global mean temperatures have already increased by 1.1 degrees since the 1900s, with most of the change having occurred in the past 50 years. So The extent of change is really most extreme in highland and polar regions, and the temperatures in tropical regions are creeping closer to the thermal limits of many organisms, including humans. Given the current policies and actions, or I would say inactions, a warming of 2.5 to 2.9 degrees C or more by the end of this century is a serious risk to us all. Warming and other manifestations of climate change, including, of course, the changes in precipitation with increased flooding in some areas and droughts in others, have important implications for vector-borne diseases through their effect on pathogens, vectors, hosts, as well as on our ability to prevent and treat these diseases. And I hope we'll be able to unpack some of these issues through the discussion with our panelists. Yet, attributing the changes in the distribution and frequency of vectors and diseases to climate change is challenging because of other factors, including land use changes, the abundance of reservoir hosts, control measures, and other contributions to these changes. Furthermore, it may be difficult to distinguish sometimes between the natural variability of the climate and human influence changes, although scientific techniques to do this are emerging. Despite these complexities, it is clear that the components of vector-borne disease systems, including pathogens, vectors, and reservoir hosts, are highly responsive to the varied environments they inhabit, and that observed changes in the rates of vector-borne diseases at given locations are now often associated with concomitant changes in the local climate. For example, warming temperatures affect the behavior, the physiologic characteristics, and the life history of both vectors and pathogens, as well as the abundance and behavior of reservoir hosts and definitive hosts, including ourselves. The interaction amongst temperature, vector, and pathogens can change the risk of human-to-human disease spread and of spillover from human to humans from reservoir hosts. Thermal performance curves illustrate the way in which temperature affects the physiological traits of pathogens and vectors and reservoir hosts, which determine the rate of disease spread in a susceptible population. These curves are commonly used to predict the potential effects of rising temperatures resulting from climate change on vector-borne disease systems. Curves for individual components of a disease system must overlap in order for transmission to occur. Thermal adaptation, acclimatization to a warming climate, or both, can potentially shift thermal performance curves and thermal tolerance limits, with important implications for expansion of the geographic range of certain diseases. Depending on their ability to adapt, vectors may no longer carry certain pathogens or may carry new ones, as climate-mediated ecosystem changes bring different pathogens, vectors, and reservoirs and human hosts together. So that's just a bit of a background context, if you like, for our discussion today. And I'm particularly personally delighted to be able to participate in this talk. My career started off as a field entomologist, working in Africa over 30 years. I won't say how many years ago, but quite some time ago. And I then had the privilege of working at the International Research Institute associated with Columbia University in New York, the International Research Institute for Climate and Society, let me say, and to lead the health work there. And that really gave me the opportunity to work closely with climate scientists and understand quite a lot more about the climate than I was expecting to have to learn. And then I came here 3 years ago to the Wellcome Trust, where I'm now based, as initially as the lead scientist on climate change, but now I'm the head of climate change. In the climate change team, I'm the head of impacts and adaptation. And so what we're talking about today very much is relevant to not only the history, my own personal history, but also to the types of interests and investments that the Trust is making today and also into the future. We recently funded a call on modelling infectious diseases, particularly vector-borne diseases, and we are looking at other opportunities to fund research in this space. So I am once again particularly pleased to be able to moderate this panel. Just to introduce you now to our panelists, I have to say it's Avriel Diaz, who's as advertised on this program, has been unable to join us. She's from the Mailman School of Public Health, and we were expecting from her really a better understanding of the climate and vector-borne disease context in Latin America. Unfortunately, she's ill and is not able to join us today. However, she will participate in the masterclass, so I very much encourage you to join that, and you'll be able to find the details on the website, and you'll be able to hear from her there. I am particularly pleased to be able to introduce you to our three panelists: Adonia Wayesa from the Ethiopian Public Health Institute. Adonia originally trained as an entomologist working on malaria in the Ethiopian highlands, and has decades of experience in not only seeking to control malaria in a very varied and complex climate, but has also been instrumental to connecting with the climate community in Ethiopia and in Africa more generally. We also have Micah Hahn, originally from CDC, now at the University of Alaska. Her interest and expertise lies in tick-borne diseases, and we're delighted to have her participate as well. And Colin Carlson from Georgetown University, where he has focused on emerging diseases, in particular the ability to forecast the change from zoonotic diseases to those with pandemic potential. And we're really delighted to have him on the panel as well. So the next piece, we'll be showing you 3 short videos for each of our panelists to be able to introduce themselves to you directly.
Hello, my name is Adonia Wayesa, a senior researcher and epidemiologist at the Ethiopian Public Health Institute. Today, I'm talking on climate change impacts on human health in Ethiopia. To start with, the direct impacts of climate change on human health are flooding that result in injuries and deaths. Second, droughts, which also causes shortage of food, malnutrition, death of animals, psychosocial problems. Moving to the indirect impacts of climate change on human health. First, shifting in geographic distribution of malaria to highland areas due to warming. Second, outbreaks of cholera, malaria, and dengue that results in cases and deaths. Third, malnutrition, which is related to food insecurity. My expertise in this regard is focusing on vector-borne disease, specifically malaria. When we see vulnerability to malaria at individual and population level, the most vulnerable group of population to malaria infection are children, pregnant women, elderly people, as well as temporary manual workers engaged in agricultural activities, especially in areas where there is poor housing, which is not convenient for vector control, where there is poor accessibility to health facilities. When we see the strategies for malaria surveillance and intervention, first, surveillance. Health facilities are conducting malaria case-based surveillance and monitor cases against thresholds to early detect epidemic. They compare the current malaria cases with the previous similar week that employs WHO weeks. In areas where implementation of elimination program, active surveillance is conducted to initiate interventions. Coming to the interventions, to mention the key ones, vector control, which includes insecticide treated nets, indoor residual spraying, and larval source management. The second one is case management, which includes treatment of parasite confirmed cases. For P. falciparum, Ethiopia uses artemisinin-based combination therapy. For Vivax, chloroquine. In areas where elimination program is in progress, 14 days treatment of Primaquine for radical cure of Vivax malaria, single dose of Primaquine for P. falciparum treatment to stop transmission. Thank you very much.
Everyone, my name is Micah Hahn, and I am an Associate Professor of Environmental Health at the Institute for Circumpolar Health Studies at the University of Alaska in Anchorage. So as I mentioned, I'm way up here in Alaska, but today I'll provide a perspective on the influence of climate on ticks and tick-borne diseases in the United States. I can also offer some perspective on ticks in the Arctic and other high-latitude regions. I'm an environmental epidemiologist, so I tend to think about the health of populations rather than individuals. And my work focuses on the health impacts of climate change. So traditionally, this work would fall under that bubble of characterizing health impacts, where we look at exposures and you test whether there's an association with a health outcome. But for a lot of climate-related health outcomes, particularly in Alaska, we don't always have the health data we need to do the epidemiologic studies. So we need to set up surveillance systems to try to collect that information. I also try to make sure that my work is really applied. So I don't want to just identify the health impacts, but I want to do it in a way that it's useful for communities to address the problem by identifying adaptation strategies. And then finally, I also have projects where we evaluate whether these programs are working and actually protecting public health in the way that we intend it to. So as I mentioned, my work really focuses on population health, but I often interface with microbiologists when we're doing pathogen surveillance or with clinicians when we're thinking about adaptation strategies, because they're often an effective way to connect with the public in a way that we can't from a public health arena. So I mentioned that I study the health impact of climate change in Alaska. And so before I talk about ticks specifically, I thought I would mention some of the interesting issues we're seeing in our region in terms of how climate change is influencing infectious disease risk. Many Alaskans rely on subsistence hunting, fishing, and gathering as part of their household food supply. Climate-mediated changes to the ecology of these animal species could influence the prevalence of zoonotic pathogens that people are exposed to. For example, human exposure to the bacteria that causes brucellosis may be affected if climate change impacts caribou herd density, maybe either through greater survival over winter or death due to changes in caribou food source. Water and sanitation infrastructure in many rural Alaskan communities is threatened by thawing permafrost, extreme storms, and erosion. Lack of solid ground means that pipes bend and break. Damage to sewage lagoons can cause contamination of water sources for drinking, washing, and laundry. And thawing permafrost can increase the turbidity of surface water. Erosion and shifting ground can cause local lakes and reservoirs to drain. All of these issues can increase the rate of water-wash diseases. So these are things like respiratory, skin, and intestinal infections caused by the lack of adequate water and sanitation. And the focus of our panel today, vector-borne diseases. So in Alaska, one of our main concerns is that as winters become more mild, ticks may be able to survive in places where they had not been able to before, potentially increasing the risk of tick-borne diseases and impacting our wildlife populations. Turning to tick-borne diseases, I'm going to focus on Lyme disease because it is the most prevalent tick-borne disease in the U.S., with an estimated 476,000 cases per year. Lyme disease is a bacterial disease transmitted through the bite of black-legged ticks. We have two different species in the U.S., one that is distributed on the East Coast and the other on the West Coast. And when we talk about the impacts of climate change and vector-borne diseases, it's important to remember that vector-borne diseases are the result of a complex ecological system that involves ticks, wildlife hosts, and people. And climate change can impact each part of this system. For example, for the black-legged tick vector, climate change can affect the mortality rate, development rate, length of the life cycle, abundance, and spatial variation. There was a study in California that looked at the change in tick habitat under various climate change scenarios. These maps show that the green areas, which show an expansion in suitable habitat for the western black-legged tick, are projected to expand by 23 to 86% across the state, compared to what we see now by the end of the century. Climate can also impact the abundance of hosts that are really good at passing on the bacteria that causes Lyme disease, like mice, relative to other animals that ticks can feed on. It can also impact the spatial variation in wildlife hosts. The maps on the right show the current distribution of the white-footed mouse on top and the future projected distribution under climate change on the bottom. And we can see that the red area, which shows the best habitat for the mouse, is moving northward. And climate change can affect people's exposure to ticks by influencing how often people are hanging out in tick habitat and going outside and hiking in forests, for example. So I hope this is helpful background information about the perspective I can bring to this panel and about how climate change influences Lyme disease, the most common tick-borne disease in the United States. I look forward to the conversation with all of you.
Hi, my name is Colin Carlson. I am an assistant professor at Georgetown University, and by training a global change biologist. I study the impacts of climate change on human health as mediated through animal health and ecosystem change. My background is in thinking about the emergence of vector-borne diseases like dengue fever and Zika, where we've seen some really, really compelling recent increases in not just burden, but also range, and where we expect to see very substantial future expansions of these diseases into new areas, particularly North America and Europe. Coming from that work, my group has sort of started to ask this question of why don't we see similar changes for other kinds of environmentally mediated diseases, and particularly zoonotic diseases, those that have an origin in animals. And we've developed something of a working theory of why this might be. We think that the reason that we see most of the primary impacts of climate change through heat or vector-borne disease, or things that are sort of closer to climate hazards, is it's both much easier to connect the mechanisms there than to, say, connect climate change to something like flu pandemic risk. And because we have more data and surveillance systems in place to actually detect those impacts. So what we've been doing is looking for ways to connect climate change to epidemic and pandemic threats and sort of get closer to the center of this circle. One of the big lessons we've learned is that taking a One Health approach can be really valuable, This is from a long-term study of plague that goes back to 1950, where we found that long-term increases or decreases in plague risk in humans have been fairly trivial. But if you actually look at what's going on under the surface in wildlife reservoirs, most of the Western United States has experienced increases in risk up to about 30 or 40%. Looking at animal systems tells us not just that there are massive changes happening as a result of climate, but we might start to see those changes happen more in the next decade. We should always remember that the future impacts of climate change will be much more stark than the ongoing and historical ones. And so we've started to zoom out a little bit and look for impacts in other zoonotic and vector-borne systems. And again, consistently, we find that we see those impacts where we have a bit more data, not just for vector-borne diseases like dengue or Lyme, but also some other diseases like melioidosis or Lassa fever. So I think there's a really compelling case that we should expect climate change to be part of the risk landscape for epidemic and pandemic threats already, that we're already seeing some of those early impacts. We also published a study this year where we showed that because of ecosystem change and because species have new contact patterns, pandemic risk is likely also increasing due to new evolutionary pathways for viral emergence. And we found that that's happening today, not just in Southeast Asia or in Africa, but here in our backyard, that there are hotspots of this change happening all around the world. And that most of that change may already have been set in motion. So we should expect climate change to have a reasonable connection to the next COVID-19. We know the answers to threats like these. We know that universal health coverage and strong disease surveillance systems are important. We know that we can put more effort into decarbonizing that sector. We know that particularly we've learned this during COVID, equitable access to countermeasures is going to be important, things like vaccines. And we know that early warning systems and sort of climate sector work can be really important for preparing for future outbreaks. Where I'll end is, I think we also know that our picture of the health burden of climate change is substantially smaller than it probably truly is, and substantially out of date. Many estimates still work from this sort of famous study from 2003. We have 20-year-old estimates of the burden of climate change. And so myself and some of my colleagues from around the world have been calling for a global burden of climate change study, actually using some of the detection and attribution methods that we have on transnational health data sets to try to get a better picture of what some of these impacts look like. I think that if we go looking, we'll find that there are much more substantial impacts of climate change across diseases, across regions, and that the present day impacts are much greater and closer to what we think the future will look like than we currently realize. Thank you for your time.
So thank you everybody, and for your presentations, and just for introducing yourself so effectively to our audience, which now means that we can engage in a discussion. They know who you are, and hopefully also when we open it up to questions, they'll be ready with their questions for you. I'm just going to start with a question to you, Adonia. You've had obviously enormous experience in Ethiopia. Not everybody knows Ethiopia well, but it's a highly complex environment with very high mountains, with lowland floodplains, with desert areas. In fact, one of the lowest areas in the world, one of the hottest areas in the world, the Dankel Depression. So an incredibly varied climate and environment, and a varied people that inhabit it. I just wanted for you to say what has been, from your research experience and just from your practice environment as a key epidemiologist in the country, the concerns about warming specifically in Ethiopia and how that has affected your understanding of malaria risk in the country.
Thank you very much, Madeline. You put the complex climate system of Ethiopia very well. Even the country is privileged with a diverse population, culture, everything is diverse. And that is a sort of good thing we observe. Fortunately or unfortunately, we have also most of the tropical disease in Ethiopia, and the population is adapted to those infectious diseases, and the malaria is one of the oldest diseases. So even the settlement of the population is geared the way they could survive vector-borne disease. Coming to the warming of the climate, especially in 1980s, 1990s, malaria is a sort of public health significance here and there. Every village below 2,000 meters above sea level is affected by malaria. But malaria didn't put itself below that 2,000 meter that we are using for operational purpose. Evidences before 5 years, as you are well aware, IRI and the Ethiopian colleagues are involved to see how warming facilitated shifting of malaria distribution to beyond that limit. Elevation is something which is very important for Ethiopian farmers because they know where to grow which crop. Still, the disease is becoming also coping up with advancing of minimum temperature increase, and that increased the population at risk to the extent of having more 6 million at risk of malaria. So it is a lot. Warming is a lot for Ethiopians. Leaving alone how it affects their daily activities in agricultural and other economic activities. So vector-borne diseases have advanced to uplands. But that area used to be salubrious, convenient, and it is written in many books that Ethiopians are brave enough to settle themselves in highland areas. But nowadays, malaria is also up-climbing to those areas which were serving as a refugee for people to live.
Thank you, Adonia. I think it illustrates really the challenges for a public health program when the disease is on the move and new populations are being exposed to a disease which they haven't had before. So, Micah, I'd like to just move to you quickly. And tick-borne diseases are particularly complicated. I mean, all vector-borne diseases are complicated, but tick-borne diseases, because they involve so many alternative hosts, and I'd just like you to, when we're looking at the relationship of climate change and tick-borne diseases specifically, how do you unpack the various influences on a disease like Lyme disease and say that this is really connected with climate change?
Yeah, that's a great question. Maybe I can use the example of Alaska to sort of start to do a little bit of that unpacking. So basically in Alaska, we have had ticks here for a long time, but none of them are known vectors of the bacteria that transmit Lyme disease. What we're seeing in the past decade is that we are getting the two black-legged tick species that I mentioned. We're seeing them getting imported into Alaska through mostly pet and human travel, but also migratory birds or another way that ticks can spread around pretty easily. And so I think that's step one, like importation, which really, maybe has something to do with climate, but not, maybe migratory birds, but not so much. That's a lot about human behavior. Where climate comes in is that historically, Alaska has been outside of the range of these ticks. We have pretty cold winters, and ticks are very sensitive to cold temps in the wintertime.
and then really hot temps in the summertime, which we don't usually have to worry about in Alaska. That's another topic for another panel. And so the concern is that with this increased importation, if we have more mild winters and a more hospitable climate, these ticks, once they're here, will be able to survive. And so I sort of think about the different pieces of the puzzle and break it up into sort of the process that must unfold, I think, for vector-borne diseases to start to take off. In addition to these ticks surviving, they have to bring the bacteria with them. So an infected tick has to come. And then they also have to find a host in Alaska that they can live on outside of humans. We have plenty of wildlife vectors. I don't think that's a problem, but that's another area where climate could potentially impact the influence of vector-borne diseases. So the changing distribution of where these reservoir species are. Colin can probably talk a lot to this, but there are different reservoirs have a different capacity to transmit the bacteria. So when a tick bites one animal, the likelihood that they'll pick up the pathogen, if it's in the mouse or the squirrel or whatever the rabbit they're feeding on, varies by species. And so sort of as the animals shift around and their whole ecological system could shift because of climate, that can play a role. And then I mentioned the last one, people. Obviously, when it's nice outside, people are outside and hanging out in tick habitat. So that's another area where climate could potentially influence this distribution of vector-borne diseases. But as you mentioned, it's a bunch of different moving parts, and climate is sort of influencing all of them. So it's tough to pin down the direct influences.
Yeah, I have a personal story on Lyme disease. So my daughter went to live in West Africa when she was 6 weeks, and everybody was like very concerned about vector-borne diseases. And then we went to live in New York when she was 10, and within a month or two, she had got Lyme disease. So, people think about, the vector-borne diseases in Africa, but actually they're really significant and important in the US as well. And but I just want to now quickly pass to Colin. And you mentioned in your presentation the opportunity that happens when you get long time series of data, that you can start to unpack some of the relationships. And the audience may not be fully aware that, of course, climate change, which is effectively a trend line, is kind of mixed in with the normal variability of the climate, from short-term weather events or maybe to seasonal climates, or even to some longer natural cycles, which are like maybe 10 or 20 years. And so your work has been very dependent on these long time series of data. How limiting is that in the sense of where you can actually do your research?
I wouldn't say it's necessarily limiting, but what I'll say is we're going through, I think, an exciting transition, right? So about 5 or 10 years ago, climate science went through the same transition where we sort of hit a wall on particularly science communication around extreme events. And that led to this shift towards a focus on detection and attribution, right? Where we look at particular climate impacts and we say with confidence, not just that there is a relationship between anthropogenic impacts and climate variability, but that the things that we are seeing are statistically speaking, much more than likely to be a direct consequence of human impacts. We can do that with climate data because we have trillions of data points that come from weather stations all around the world. But even then, to your point, Africa is famously sort of a blank spot in terms of weather station data, right? Where at the same time, that's where we need to be doing a lot of this attribution work. We have the same problem in infectious disease work. We have really beautiful long-term time series data from the United States that we have been very lucky to work with, thanks to our partners at the USDA. There are some really beautiful data sets on malaria from Africa that sort of have been put together over decades by researchers. So we have a few of these sort of long-term transnational data sets that let us do this kind of attribution work, but they are few and far between, not just because time is a limiting factor, but space is a limiting factor. getting transnational data sets together is very hard. And a lot of national surveillance systems have long-term data sets that we could be using, but actually starting to put that together and get regional or global pictures is incredibly challenging. I think the optimistic thing here, right, is we know a lot of this data exists, right? We have a century of malaria data from Africa because people took the time to digitize a century worth of handwritten notes and field, surveys and medical entomology records. And we can do the same thing in other systems. We can take the time to actually build these data sets. It's just a sort of question of investment in actually building those data systems.
Well, I think I'd like to just pick up on what you just said there and turn back to Adonia, because Adonia, you've worked in, like I say, a very complex environment, and your work has involved trying to bring in climate knowledge and climate information into the health system to inform some of the decision making. Can you first talk to us a little bit about the challenges around the data issues that have emerged at the national level, and what types of activities have been developed locally to try and respond to those challenges?
Thank you very much, Madeline, for bringing that important question to explain the Ethiopian situation related to the health system in improving how to respond to climate-sensitive disease. So to start with, I think before we see the challenge, when we see the setting of the Ethiopian health system, there has been expansion of health facilities, and the health system has progressed a lot related to this health system development program and currently health transformation plan. So with the expansion of these health services, there has been the importance of data, the importance of evidence-based action become an issue. So especially related to after Ebola, after the pandemic, there are a lot of things that we have realized, but the data issue, as Colin already mentioned, we have history of formal malaria control program since the 1950s. But if you ask me data for historical data for Ethiopia, that may be a challenge for us. So one of our challenges is that the documentation issue, while we are shifting from the paper-based to digitization, all those historical data were not captured very well, I can say. I joined the malaria program during the mid-1990s, and I remember that was the time when malaria epidemic was overwhelming most part of the country. But if you ask me, do you have epidemic data for that time span, it is questionable. So having data is one of the issues, especially for public health. Not only having data, where you have data and sharing, accessing the data is also one of the problem. So especially public health data related to epidemics is one of the sensitive areas to be shared outside the system, and that calls for the attention of partnering institutions or collaborative institutions. If you are working with the local institutions like National Meteorological Data, the current Ethiopian Meteorological Institute, there is a close collaboration, and we are working for a strategic plan that is developed at national level, and there might not be a problem to share data. But when you are going out of your using for research and funded projects, you need to have a different memorandum of understanding, and that is good. Having a good memorandum of understanding is good, and still quality of data is another issue. So we're talking about climate data, quality issue, so on and so forth. AMI or NMA has came up with quality data in that regard, and still it is an assignment for the health sector to have a data set which is clean and accessible and usable. So for this, efforts are underway for the last few years, and my institute has a National Data Management Center, which is closely working with where Colin is working, University of Washington. So now we are sharing the experience to our African colleagues in the region. So I think one of the challenges along, we are proceeding to the solution. We are moving towards the solution. We identified the challenge, and we have tried to solve this issue. Another challenge, which is calling the attention of partners, maybe audiences in this panel might understand me very well from Ethiopia and around the globe. The data science is one of the areas that is evolving. I'm a senior researcher, but I'm not advancing in data science. I need to know how modeling is working, and you know, it's not the duration of your stay in the research, but you have to be exposed to a system that is evolving, and the data science, modeling, all those things are one of the areas my colleagues at home are looking for, to have young researchers looking for capacity building and the partnership. Another area is, you know, this South-South collaboration. You know, we are facing similar challenges of health impacts we are experiencing. We don't have South-South collaboration, which is institutionalized. I might have somebody from Kenya, from Malaria program, and I can work with him. I have a good friend, James Sang, but we don't have institutional collaborations that is bringing us together, and he can travel, I can travel, and we can have a capacity building sort of collaboration. All those things are some of the pending issues, and we have to use the platform which is available. For instance, we have IGAD countries, member countries, in which they can have a platform to work together, and then they can stretch up to the north where there is no capacity to address their issues. Those are the things. But one thing, if I mention it, it is a common problem, that is financing, and that is another issue. But you know, if our decision makers, policy makers understand us very well, what we are trying to do and what we are trying to contribute, if we have the resource, still financing is not something that we are looking from the north only, but from our system. So I think financing is one of the things that we have to locally access, and we have to work and compete with the other part of the globe to contribute to knowledge development and knowledge sharing. I think those are the points.
Yeah. Adonia, that's very, very helpful. You've basically brought a lot of issues to the table. I'm just going to follow that up with a question to Micah now. Adonia is talking about first about the equity issues around partnership, the importance of South-South partnership, and then extending to the global north when that is essential for delivering something specific. But in your experience, how and the development of surveillance systems, it's all at the end of the day looking for a change in behavior in response to information. How do you bring an equitable relationship to the stakeholders that you're engaged in? How do you engage communities? How do you engage policymakers in order to have effectively the science that's used in surveillance actually used effectively and taken up by communities.
Yeah, thank you very much again.
Sorry, Adonia, I've just passed the question to Micah.
Okay, sorry.
Okay, so I'll come back to you with another one in a minute.
Hopefully I can, it's super interesting to sort of hear the different perspectives from different parts of the globe. So I'm curious to hear your response to this, Adonia. Thinking about vector-borne diseases, or I guess tick-borne diseases, specifically in the United States, a lot of the surveillance is conducted by, we have something called vector control agencies that are certainly not evenly distributed across the United States. And they're often quite underfunded and very busy with mosquito-borne diseases. On the West Coast in California, a lot of these agencies are really focused on mosquito-borne diseases. In the Eastern United States, there's a bit more with tick information. It's similar to the sort of what Colin was talking about in terms of how difficult it is to get transnational data. When you think about tick information in the United States, it's very difficult to get trans-state data because everyone is sort of doing their surveillance a little bit differently. And people have been doing it for a different amount of time. People put a different amount of effort into it in terms of the number of folks that are out there doing it, the duration of the surveillance season for each place. And so it's really tough to sort of get a coherent picture of what's going on across this large space. And then we think about places like Alaska, where tick-borne diseases is really an emerging issue. And we don't have a history of tick surveillance at all, because why? There are a lot of other pressing things to be worried about. And so we're at this place where we started to see this issue creeping in, basically veterinarians are reporting like, hey, we're seeing these ticks that we don't recognize. And that's sort of a flag to say, this is a new thing. Maybe we should start looking for it. And, the work that we've been doing over the past few years has been basically to create the first surveillance system for ticks in Alaska so that we can set that baseline. Because without knowing where we are today, it's really hard to measure how things change and project how things might change. So that's sort of like step number one, which I think we're going to start seeing a lot more often. We're going to have problems in places where we didn't used to have them, essentially. And because of that, we're extra under-equipped to be able to measure what's going on. In terms of engaging, so I was mentioning that's the formal network, I think, of surveillance. A lot of places have started to do more citizen science around tick-borne diseases or tick distribution. Because it's so intensive. Normally when you're searching for ticks, you walk with a white blanket in the woods and slowly drag it behind you. And every 10 meters, you stop and you look to see how many ticks you have. And then you take them off and you put them in a vial and then you keep moving. And that's just to do a very small space. And ideally, you need to do this every week over the whole season. So it's a really time-intensive process to be able to collect ticks. So people have turned to passive surveillance. So that's basically you set up the system of being able to accept ticks. And then this is what we've been doing in Alaska. Anyone that finds a tick on themselves, on a pet, on their luggage when they came back from their trip to Tennessee, on wildlife, people are hunting or they find a dead vole in their backyard, they can take those ticks and then send them into our state vet. And we now have a system in place where we can identify them, we can log them in a database, and we're starting to, with very few resources. Alaska does not have the resources to put into doing systematic tick surveillance across this huge geographic area, nor should we. There are a lot of other ways we should be spending our money. But by setting up this more systematic passive surveillance system, we can really engage people, individuals, but also clinicians, veterinarians, folks that are interfacing, wildlife biologists that are interfacing with ticks to really start to develop a pretty comprehensive data set over a long time period. And the double whammy of that, I guess, is that you also get education. So people are learning about ticks and becoming more aware of the issue up here.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So I want to just move on a little bit. We know that our audience substantially comes from a biomedical background. I want us to think a little bit more. We've talked a lot of very practical issues in terms of health surveillance, in terms of delivery of health services, and underpinning research supporting emerging infectious diseases. But let's try and say to this particular audience, we know it's a global audience. We know that this is a particular specialty, if you like, in the community. What are the upstream research questions that we should be motivating? What is the work that the bench scientists should be doing that would support the more epidemiological, field-based, public health based research? I'm going to start with you, Colin, and give us your first take. Why should they be involved? Why should they care? What's in their interest to work on climate change and vector-borne diseases?
Sure. So I think the sort of simplest way I can say this is, vaccines are climate adaptation, right? They are a tool that we can use, not just vaccines, but therapeutics and diagnostics, right? Biomedical countermeasures are sort of the bread and butter of outbreak response for vector-borne disease. I think there are also really big gaps that we need to solve if we want that to actually work. So for example, yellow fever, we have a reliable vaccine, but we have regular shortages. We know that that's going to be an issue in a changing climate. With dengue, we're still waiting on a good tetravalent vaccine that we can use around the world. Now, those clinical trials coming out of Takeda are looking really promising. That's really exciting. Everybody, I think, in the world has their fingers crossed on that. But there are still plenty of vector-borne viruses and other pathogens for which we don't have reliable countermeasures. I think that severely limits our ability to deal with future threats.
Thank you. So, and now, Adonia, just thinking about the upstream research, and obviously a lot of that research is done in the north. We know with COVID response, for instance, that a lot of the genomics work, the vaccine development, et cetera, has been done in high-income countries. Some of that capability is now being developed in Africa and elsewhere. In the Ethiopian context, how would you encourage your more biomedical researchers to get involved in climate change and health issues?
Yeah, thank you very much. I think one of the things we have to work on with researchers is the understanding how climate is affecting health. One of the areas researchers have to focus on, I think that area is a gray area. No health outcome is free of climate change. Any health issue, starting from the period of Aristotle, not Aristotle, the biomedical development of biomedical, from the start, there was the association of health with climate is there. So still it is advancing. So any biomedical researcher has to consider climate change is an issue, and they have to focus on mainstreaming of climate issues into their research. So,
thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. And Micah, just to you now, like we said, with tick-borne disease are particularly complicated. If you had a whole team of biomedical researchers to support your work, what would you ask them to do?
So one thing that's right around the bend, actually, we're really on the cusp of having this as a tool. But in terms of democratizing surveillance, right now, when we collect ticks, I said it's a really very manual process out in in woods or grasses. We basically have to look at each tick under a microscope and use a dichotomous key, and that's how you figure out what kind of tick it is. And as you imagine, again, very time intensive, and not every place has the resources to be able to do this. People are working on using molecular techniques to be able to ID ticks. So if we can send them in to a lab that just can send back a table of like, here are all your IDs. It took us, an hour to run 1,000 ticks. Like that would be amazing and would really enable us to have a more complete picture of what's going on and how things are changing.
Thank you so much. So I think now we're going to open it up to questions from the audience. And we have a whole bunch of questions in our question section. And the first one, Adonia, is going to be, the first one is a general question to all of the speakers. Which says, it's a little bit a reiteration of a question I asked earlier, but I'd like each of you to try and unpack it a little bit further, but very quickly. Research to find climate change effects on infectious diseases contain many confounding factors. How would you consider cause-effect relationships regarding these many other confounders? So yes, in a nutshell, what tools or techniques do you use to separate out the climate component from other confounders? Colin, I'll start with you.
So I think there's a lot of really powerful tools that we can take from, in particular, econometrics and sort of other fields that have been really staring at causal inference problems for centuries. In some of our own work, we've been looking at sort of disentangling the effects of health system change and population change from the actual climate signal in malaria long term. And econometric approaches like fixed effects regressions give us a really elegant way to do that. They're not perfect, nothing is, but I think those have had a lot of promise for doing things like removing confounders or really testing for sort of signals over time. There's been some really beautiful work applying those methods to deforestation in the Amazon, to HIV and rainfall. I think just the biggest challenge as always is getting the data together to power those methods, right? We can't remove confounders from small data sets. We can only remove confounders from data sets that are big enough for us to actually pull out the confounders and the signal at the same time.
That's really important. Actually, I'm just going to ask a follow-up question to that, which is, how did you, in your work, integrate time series research into the early warning systems used for decision-making? How do you connect the two?
So we're still at the early stages of that, I would say. I think there's a methodological problem to bridge there. The sort of time series analyses that are really good at forecasting aren't necessarily the ones that are meant for sort of carefully decomposing what's going on in a time series. And so I think there's some interesting methods development to do there. I think that the bottom line, though, is there's a lot of knowledge transfer between the two problems. If we look at the long-term effects on malaria or dengue of climate, and we see that there are particular interventions that have been really important, that tells us something for how we think about early warning systems. When we look at the long history of malaria, we see that the global malaria eradication program in the 60s has basically an order of magnitude greater effect than any long-term effect of climate, because it was a massive coordinated change in how we did vector control and outbreak prevention. And that tells us something about early warning systems, right? It tells us how much of the system is driven by climate and how much of the system is driven by our decision-making, which I think can be a really powerful tool, not just for research, but also for advocacy.
So Adonia, can I just ask you to pick up on that? Because we know Ethiopia is very strongly impacted by El Nino. The El Nino Southern Oscillation is the natural system which drives relatively short-term changes in the climate. And when at the moment we've been in a La Nina for a number of years, which has certain implications for the climate in Ethiopia. Your work on malaria and other diseases, and in fact malnutrition in Ethiopia. Could you tell the audience something about the way the Ethiopian government or yourself are thinking about the use of climate information in early warning, whether it's for drought or for malaria, etc.?
Thank you very much. Yeah, this is one of the gray areas that we have to advance our collaboration with various institutions at local and global and regional level. Yeah, we have a system in which co-production is initiated in Ethiopia between Ethiopian Public Health Institute and Ethiopian Meteorological Institute. So there is an initiative to use climate information for, especially for malaria, as part of surveillance system, to include climate information in the surveillance system. But this system is at its initial stage, and it looks for validation and advancing it to operational level to be used by health professionals.
Yeah, I think there's a lot to learn from the more the livelihoods and agricultural community or the disaster community, where in Ethiopia, when we have a major El Nino, in some regions, particularly say the north west, where you get significant drought periods. So that might affect malaria in certain ways. Maybe in some ways it might actually reduce malaria in some areas. But then, of course, when you have drought, it tends to be warmer, which might increase malaria in other areas. But we know there'll be a lot of population impact just because of the droughts that are associated with El Nino. And then just another question from the audience for you, Adonia, specifically about Anopheles stevensii. It says there's a growing threat in malaria in African countries. And the questioner asks specifically for your experience of Anopheles stevensii in Ethiopia.
Yeah, thank you very much. Currently, the issue of Anopheles stevensii is upstream in the local audience and the global media. So there is a dedicated team conducting a national survey on Anopheles stevensii in its distribution. Still, we need more evidence where Anopheles stevensii has transmitted malaria. We know it is exotic species that invaded Ethiopia recently. Most part of eastern Ethiopia, especially east of the Rift Valley, has evidence there is Anopheles stevensii widely distributed in urban settings. Current malaria resurgence is reported in western and central parts of Ethiopia. So we look for more evidence how this Anopheles stevensii is contributing to malaria transmission. But we know it is one of the species that can overcome season by breeding itself in small containers and by having biological advantage because it is resistant to most of the vector control tools we are using currently. So we are very much curious about it, and the National Malaria Elimination Program has developed a strategy because we are very much worried it will increase malaria incidence in the coming years and months ahead of us. But we haven't have a definite evidence it is currently contributing to increase in malaria incidence in Ethiopia.
So thank you, Adonia. So I'm just going to turn to Micah, where there's a question specifically for you around how you work with clinicians to identify adaptation strategies. Is that a question that you would like to respond to? Yeah, good.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I can give a couple of examples. Thanks for that question. So I guess with regard to vector-borne disease, I work actually both with human and animal clinicians. Again, Colin mentioned the One Health approach, which has been really essential for our work up in Alaska around vector-borne diseases. And for both doctors and veterinarians are really a key point of patient education about, when you're traveling to tick endemic areas, just raising the awareness of tick-borne diseases, how to do tick checks, the importance of using flea and tick prevention meds on your pet when traveling. People that have grown up in Alaska have had no experience with ticks. If you grew up in New England, every time you go outside, you need to tuck your pants into your socks and how to, what the ticks are the size of a pinhead. It's a common thing that you've had to deal with, kind of like us and grizzly bears in Alaska. Everyone that grows up here knows you carry your bear spray, but it's just a whole shift in thinking. And so working with clinicians to really engage with patients is a really important aspect of our work. In addition, working with clinicians to recognize the signs of vector-borne diseases or of tick-borne diseases, and even considering it in their differential diagnosis. A lot of times, because it's not a really common issue up here, you see a rash and it's not the first thing you think of. So just raising awareness with folks that way. I'll give one more quick one, not related to tick-borne diseases, but another issue that we're seeing up in Alaska is extreme heat, surprisingly. We've had a bunch of really warm summers in the past few years that we have just not experienced before. And like tick-borne diseases, where Alaskans are not really prepared for it. Most people don't have air conditioning. People aren't physically adapted to it. We have really long days. And so we don't get that cool down period at night because it's sunny all the time because we're at high latitudes. And so I've been working with the National Weather Service is we don't have a heat warning system in Alaska. And so this is something that they're starting to do. We did an epidemiologic assessment to help identify, at what temperature thresholds are we seeing health impacts in Alaskans in terms of emergency department visits. So now the key part in working with clinicians is that we've just hosted a listening session to sort of hear from people on the ground, present these results and say, to clinicians, people working with elderly populations, our homeless population, doing emergency preparedness, like this is what we're seeing in the data. Does that resonate with what you see on the ground? And what's been your experience with dealing with extreme heat in these vulnerable populations? And as we're developing this heat warning system for the first time in Alaska, what information did you wish you had, 2 summers ago when we were seeing temperatures that we've never experienced before? So clinicians are super helpful basically for ground truthing a lot of what we see in the data, and helping us think about, this would work or this wouldn't work in terms of adaptation strategies. They're really like a key, like real, a point of realism, I think, from when you're sitting sort of behind your computer screen and making sure that whatever the interventions that you're proposing will actually be effective in our population.
Oh, thank you. So I'm just going to ask you a follow-on question to that. And this is one from the audience where it says, climate impacts on health are expected to be felt by some of the most vulnerable populations globally. What efforts are in place to reduce or mitigate for stigma associated with being those most impacted populations? And you've just described quite a broad range of populations that could be affected.
Yeah, that's a great question. Gosh, I'm not sure I can answer it totally fully. I can maybe one way to think about it, when I talk about, for example, the heat work that I was talking about, often we sort of, we know from clinical medicine that there are certain populations that are vulnerable to extreme heat, people with chronic kidney disease, older populations, that type of thing. That's really what when we're talking about vulnerability, we break it into 3 components. So exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity. Those clinical things sort of fall under sensitivity. Like when it's 100 degrees outside, some people are more sensitive to that than others because they have a chronic disease, for example. Exposure is sort of another way that people can feel differential impacts of heat or any climate exposure. People, outdoor workers, people who are homeless, people, there are reasons that people might have, it's 100 degrees. I'm sitting inside in my air-conditioned house, clicking away on my computer. Summertime in Alaska is when we do road construction. There are people that are out there flagging for, 8, 12 hours a day. They're experiencing the heat in a different way than I am, for example. And then also adaptive capacity. People have different levels of resources to be able to react to the extreme heat. So for example, if all of our emergency warnings are only in English, people who are non-English speakers maybe don't have the same level of access to warnings that other people do. Maybe an elderly person who lives alone, doesn't have the ability to run to the store to get a fan. Maybe someone with a disability similarly doesn't have a plan for evacuation. So I feel like when we're coming up with public health interventions, I think it's been helpful for me to sort of break down this issue of vulnerability into these different components and think about like, why is someone vulnerable as opposed to just labeling them as vulnerable? Because then it becomes more actionable. And I feel like that's kind of been a helpful way for me to discuss it with people.
Right, thank you. So here's a question for Colin. It isn't all about warming, yeah? So which we might predict could lead to directional selection on traits in pathogens and vectors, but also greater fluctuations in climate instability at a regional level. This is the way the question is put, which we might expect to select for greater plasticity in traits amongst pathogens and vectors. Are we effectively addressing this as scientists?
I love questions that have that framing of, are we doing enough? Because it's very easy to simply answer that, no, we should be thinking about this more. I think this is sort of a specter that is looming in a lot of conversations we have about things like thermal performance curves or sort of climate health hazard relationships. We know that there are serious risks that, for instance, the upper thermal limits of certain mosquitoes or certain pathogens could change. We don't have a great predictive framework for that. We don't know which pathogens we're most worried about in that context. We don't know which vectors we're most worried about in that context. There's been some really beautiful work out of a couple labs thinking about this in particularly 80s systems, but there's still a lot of open questions. I think that the bottom line is always, that we're going to be faced with things that we can't anticipate. And this is how I think about evolutionary risks in general in the climate space. If we build good vector management systems, if we build resilient public health systems, we should be prepared for the possibility of those evolutionary changes. But from a scientific standpoint, we definitely need to be thinking about that more.
Thank you. Like you say, it is always easier to say we need to do more, but I think that in the area of in this area, we're only starting to touch on it really, because thinking that climate change is actually it's disrupting ecosystems, it's actually bringing different vectors, pathogens, reservoir hosts together in a different mix at different seasons in different ways. We don't know the consequences of that. Some of it might mean that certain diseases die out. Other times it might mean we get an increase in spillovers, an increase in jumps from one species to another. So I think you're right, there's a lot of uncertainty in that space. But I'd also say I think that quite a significant lack of awareness certainly in the public health environment that these risks are emerging. Yeah, and that we might get more kind of unexpected outbreaks as a result. I just want to go now back to Adonia, and here's a question. I'll try to interpret the question because the person who's written it is asking for something specific, but it says, is there any evidence that resilience hubs or community engagement hubs can be useful in improving a community's ability to adapt or address climate-influenced public health risks? And I suppose what the person means by resilience hubs or community engagement hubs, there may be a very specific meaning to that. But just taking a bit of license on that, I think it's really about the question of community engagement and empowerment in responding to climate change impacts and being a better able to adapt to the changes that are being observed. So would you be able to make some comments on that?
Thank you very much. I appreciate the question raised because we have never used the community in our discussion so far. I appreciate the question raised from the audience. Coming to the question, this take me to one of the workers contributor to IPCC, in which indigenous knowledge and local knowledge is very important as adaptation aspect. And we have to engage the community through what they know, how they are adapted and how they lived. That means by not only telling them what we know, but we have to hear what they used to adapt to it. Still, we cannot limit ourselves to the community knowledge because the climate experienced 50 years before for an adult who is 50 years this time, and somebody who is 20 years and so they are not experiencing the same climate, and there is advancement of science to learn a lot of things, and we have to share and simplify, contextualize to the community how they have to adapt. But one thing which is very clear that we have to work with the community is that there is no way we can skip food security, nutrition issues, and technology issues have to move down to the community. Rural electrification, access to power, access to internet, all those things are very important if we would like to hear from them and if we would like to share our experience and the outputs of science. There has to be technology pushed to the community, infrastructure that should be moved to the community. So this is how we can make a good bridge between the modern science and the indigenous knowledge. So everything about resilience is how we can make ideal living for the community and as output from the science and the learning from them and modifying it to for them to be simplified. Yeah.
Thank you. Brilliant. A lot of really rich comments there, and so much to do around not only community empowerment through development effectively that will enable people to respond effectively. Micah, can I just go back to you to say, do you have your experience in engaging at the community level?
Sure. Yeah, I can offer a quick example. So I think everything you said really resonates with me, Adonia, in terms of, I think there's a super powerful thing that can happen when you have both sort of a scientific perspective and local knowledge, indigenous knowledge coming together. In Alaska, we've had people living in Alaska for a very long time who have been dealing with changes to the environment. That said, as you mentioned, people used to be a lot more nomadic and are now settled in areas, which is different. And also the extremes in terms of the environmental changes people are experiencing are also different. And so it's a little bit outside of what folks have experienced before. A specific example is some work that we've been doing around wildfires in Alaska, which is another major impact that we're seeing up here. And we have done studies looking at the mental health impacts of wildfire up in Alaska. And we've done that through talking with community members and behavioral health providers, wildland firefighters, folks who are on the ground and experiencing these things. In addition to asking people, what were the impacts of wildfire and wildfire smokes, sometimes burning over an entire summer near your community. We also talk to people about what are the supports that you think could be effective to prevent this in the future. And through these interviews, people came up with over 100 different supports that would be useful for supporting mental health around wildfires and disaster in Alaska. And that's something that we never would have been able to come up with if it had just been academics sitting around trying to think about, here are all the possible intervention strategies. We were able to come up with locally relevant adaptation strategies that would be accepted in the population, like way more adeptly than a researcher. And so if you're not engaging local communities, you're really like missing a major source of really useful information.
Thank you. So we're actually 5 minutes away from the end of our session. I'm just going to ask all of you the same question, which I think is a really nice one to wrap up the session. And that is how the global research regarding awareness on climate change, vector-borne diseases, can be more effective and so that all can get benefit, and that the programs can reach many countries around the globe. So it's really about how can the research that we're all engaged in become much more effective in terms of delivering benefits to the global community. Colin, I'm going to start with you.
Sure. So I think the biggest challenge that we face is that as researchers, we know that the health impacts of climate change are probably a lot more extensive than we can show. We're limited by time and personnel and funding and data. And all of that means that the picture of climate change impacts we have is just much narrower than what is actually out there. And I think that becomes a communication problem, right? We really want to be able to sit down with policymakers and with the public and say, it is this bad, there are this many lives we're losing. So I think starting to sort of fill those gaps systematically, this is why we've been calling for a global burden of climate change study. This is why I think we can make a lot of progress on transnational cooperation in terms of sharing health data so that we can actually identify these impacts. I think getting to a point where we do things like real-time detection and attribution, and we can say, you know, this loss of life is attributable to climate change. I think all of that will help us as communicators say, this is the world we live in today. This is what it's like to be in a world that is 1.2 degrees warmer.
Okay, thank you. And Adonia, just your last take on how can the global community benefit from the research work that we're all engaged in?
Thank you very much. I think research is one of the important tools for us to communicate upstream and downstream. So also climate change is a universal phenomenon that is affecting every nation and all people. It is affecting every one of us, every nation in a different way. So we have to have a local priority that Ethiopia needs a special situation analysis for itself and should craft adaptation approach in its own way. So brilliant. I think understanding the local situation and financing in that way is very important, and local priority setting is very important to me.
And very quickly, Micah, can you just make one quick comment on that? We're going to close.
Sure, definitely. I think in a lot of places in the United States, we're still fighting an upstream battle in terms of like, is climate change real? What are the causes of climate change? It's much more difficult to argue with the impacts of climate change because everybody is feeling them and experiencing them in their own lives. And so I think the research can really help sort of quantify that and wrap that up into a piece that can be used, like Colin said, for communication with policymakers, which
Thank you. I just want to take a second to thank you as panelists. I think you've been a fantastic, active team, and also our audience for the great questions that they've submitted, and of course for those who actually put the panel together, the Keystone Symposium and the Global Consortium for Climate Change Education. A big thank you to all of you. And I think with that comment, I wish you very happy seasonal holidays ahead for those of you who will be celebrating, and thank you all.